They say funerals are for closure, for honoring a life, for unity. But when my husband passed, my stepdaughter made sure I wasn't welcome. She banned me from the service, mocked me as I stood outside the cemetery gates in the rain, clutching lilies and 30 years of memories. What she didn't know. Weeks before his death, my husband changed the will. And when the lawyer read it aloud, in front of every smug face that had turned me away, her smirk disappeared. Everything she thought was hers wasn't. What happened next left the whole room silent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. I'll write a first-person narrative from Eleanor's perspective following your outlined requirements. Before the gates closed, before the rain turned my lilies into something less beautiful, before Lauren's mockery echoed like a church bell, calling others to witness my humiliation. My life was measured in small devotions. I'm Eleanor Whitcomb, 73 years old, though my hands still move with the precision they held when I was a seamstress in my mother's shop. After Jonathan proposed, a quiet widower at 52 to my 41 years, I put away my needle and thread to thread myself instead through the fabric of his life. His first wife had been a force of nature, leaving behind grand rooms and a daughter who inherited all her fieriness without the grace. I'd entered their lives not as a replacement, but as a careful mender of small tears, preparing meals he actually ate, attending school events Lauren ignored, organizing the household ledgers with a precision Jonathan appreciated. I wasn't pretty like his first wife, but I was useful, dependable, the kind of woman who noticed when his favorite shirt needed mending or when his morning coffee grew cold. For 30 years, I occupied the edges of his success, the footnotes of his achievements. While he designed buildings that made headlines, I designed a home that made him happy. I watched Lauren grow from a resentful teenager into an even more resentful adult, who turned my kindness into invisibility. When she married and had Billy, I was allowed the role of babysitter, never grandmother. I sewed quilts she'd later donate without telling me, baked birthday cakes she'd replace with catered ones. Each small rejection taught me to shrink further until I was practically transparent in my own life. The rain began as I stood at the iron gates of Ocean View Cemetery, fat drops that hit the headstones with the sound of distant applause. My black gloves were already damp, the lilies trembling as my hands shook, not from cold, but from the dawning realization of what was happening. Lauren stood just inside the gate, wearing a black dress that cost more than my entire wardrobe. Her auburn hair was perfect despite the weather, her makeup flawless, even as tears, real or performed, I could never tell with her, streaked down her cheeks. Behind her, black-clad figures moved like chess pieces toward the chapel, where Jonathan waited for his final ceremony. "Excuse me," I said quietly, stepping forward. "I need to get inside." Lauren turned slowly, her green eyes, Jonathan's eyes, scanning me from head to toe. "Eleanor!" She said my name like it tasted bitter. "What are you doing here?" My heart began that old familiar hammering it did whenever Lauren looked at me that way, as if I were trespassing in my own life. "I'm here for Jonathan's funeral." No. The word was simple, final. "You're not." Around us, other mourners slowed their approach, pretending not to watch while leaning in to catch every word. I recognized neighbors, Jonathan's business associates, people who'd eaten at our dinner table, who'd complimented my pot roast and asked about my garden. Now they watched me be barred from my own husband's funeral, like it was an unfortunate play they couldn't look away from. "Lauren, please, I'm his wife." "We're his wife," she corrected. "And you're not welcome here. This is for family only." The word family hit me like ice water. After 30 years. After every meal prepared, every shirt ironed, every lonely night when Jonathan worked late, and I waited up just to say goodnight. I have every right. You have no rights here. Lauren stepped closer, lowering her voice to a hiss. You were a convenience, a housekeeper he married. When my mother died, something died in him too. You were just the warm body filling the space. She stepped back, raising her voice again for the audience. I'm sorry, Eleanor, but I can't allow you to disrupt this solemn occasion. This is about honoring my father's memory, not about your need for attention. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few people looked at their phones, pretending they hadn't heard. Sadie, my neighbor, stood near the chapel steps, her face a mask of shock and sympathy. But no one moved to help me. No one contradicted Lauren's version of reality. My throat felt like sandpaper, but I managed to speak. Jonathan would want me here. Jonathan, Lauren said slowly, savoring each syllable, shared everything with me. His work, his dreams, his finances. If he wanted you here, he would have said so. But he didn't. She smiled then, sharp and victorious. You know what he did tell me? That he was tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of playing happy families when you could never replace what we lost. The rain turned from drops to needles, but I barely felt them. The lilies in my hands, white because they'd been Jonathan's favorite, began to droop, their petals bruising against my black wool coat. I'd spent this morning arranging them just so, remembering how Jonathan once said they reminded him of purity and new beginnings. We'd planted a whole bed of them behind the house when we first married. Please, I heard myself whisper, just 10 minutes to say goodbye. Lauren's laugh was music from a broken instrument. 10 minutes? You had 30 years to say goodbye. Every night you could have told him. Every morning when you served him breakfast. You had your time. She gestured to the mourners now walking past us, averting their eyes. These people understand quality. They understand achievement. They understand why someone like my father would want dignity in his final hours, not reminders of his compromise. The word hung in the wet air like fog. Compromise. That's what our marriage had been to her. All my quiet devotions reduced to one cutting word. I looked past her to the chapel where Jonathan lay. My mind flooded with memories. His hand on mine as we signed our marriage certificate. His grateful smile when I learned his favorite recipes. The way he'd reach for my hand without thinking when we watched television. Had those moments meant as little to him as Lauren suggested? Or had she simply rewritten our story in her own ink? You should go now, Lauren said, her tone almost gentle, like speaking to a child. Before you embarrass yourself further. Behind her, I caught a glimpse of Billy, William, Lauren's son, who'd always called me Eleanor instead of grandmother, but with kindness in his voice. He stood near the chapel entrance, shifting from foot to foot, his 24-year-old face a mirror of the conflict he must have felt. When our eyes met, he gave a small apologetic shrug before looking away. The rain drummed harder against the umbrella someone held over me. Sadie had moved closer, shielding me without interfering. Her presence gave me just enough strength to do what I'd practiced all my life. Maintain dignity in the face of dismissal. I placed the lilies on the ground, just outside the gate, arranging them carefully on the wet grass. Water immediately began to soak through the wrapping paper, but I took my time making sure they looked as beautiful as possible, even in their abandonment. Lovely flowers, Lauren commented, watching my careful placement. Too bad you'll never see where they were actually meant to go. Inside, where family places their tributes. She paused, letting the words sink in. where you'll never set foot again." I stood slowly, my knees protesting the movement. At 73, grief made every ache more pronounced. The mourners had mostly moved past us now, leaving just Lauren and me at the gates, with Sadie keeping her respectful distance. "I loved him," I said simply. "Love?" Lauren's eyebrows arched. "Oh, Eleanor, you were his comfort, his habit, his safe choice when he was too broken to choose better. Don't confuse gratitude with love." She turned then, her heels clicking against the stone path as she walked away from me. But she called back, not bothering to quiet her voice. "Enjoy your cottage, Eleanor. Make yourself some tea. Watch your afternoon soaps. Live whatever life you have left. Because this..." She gestured to the funeral, the cemetery, the gathering of mourners. "Isn't yours to be part of." I stood at the gates as Lauren disappeared into the chapel. The rain soaked through my coat, turned my careful hair arrangement into a gray tangle, made my black shoes squelch with each small movement. Mourners continued to pretend not to notice me as they passed, though I caught whispers that carried on the wind. Always thought it was odd. Different when his first wife was alive. Lauren probably has her reasons. Sadie approached finally, her umbrella extended to shelter me. "Eleanor, dear, let's get you home. We'll make some hot tea, change into dry clothes." But I didn't move. In my handbag, I felt the weight of something Lauren didn't know about. Something that made my spine straighten, despite the rain, despite the humiliation, despite the 30 years of being treated as a compromise. "Not yet," I told Sadie softly. "I have something to attend to after this." She looked at me curiously but nodded. As we walked back to her car, I touched the envelope again. Stiff legal paper in a waterproof pouch. Jonathan's initials on the seal. HWL, Henry W. Lowell, his lawyer, written in the corner. The service would last an hour. The post-funeral reception at the house would begin afterward. Henry had been instructed to read the will at precisely 3 o'clock, in front of all the mourners who'd witnessed me barred from Jonathan's final goodbye. Lauren didn't know. None of them knew. But in 1 hour, everything would change. The rain continued to fall as Sadie drove me away from the cemetery. But for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't the one drowning in it. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The sound of windshield wipers filled the silence as Sadie drove me away from the cemetery. My coat dripped onto her leather seats, but she didn't mention it, just cranked the heat higher and squeezed my hand briefly before turning onto Harbor Road. "What did you mean?" she asked when we stopped at the light. "About having something to attend to after this." I felt the envelope in my bag, its edges sharp through the fabric. "Nothing I can discuss yet, but I need to be back at the house by 3. Sadie raised an eyebrow but nodded. We'd been neighbors for 15 years, close enough that she'd witnessed the slow erosion of my status in Jonathan's life, or perhaps the gradual revelation of where I'd always stood. Back at my cottage, the small house I'd owned before marrying Jonathan, kept on his insistence as a safety net, I changed into dry clothes. As I peeled off my stockings, memories flooded back like the tide. My first year as Jonathan's wife, I'd moved from this cottage to his grand house overlooking Cadillac Mountain. Lauren had been 18 then, already talking about college in Boston, already looking through me rather than at me. I remembered my first attempt at being the stepmother, preparing her favorite meal based on what the housekeeper had told me. Lauren had taken one bite, declared it different from how Mother made it, and pushed the plate away. "It's close enough," Jonathan had said mildly, not unkindly, but not taking my side either. That phrase became the soundtrack of our marriage. Close enough, good enough, better than nothing. I made tea with trembling hands and sat at my small kitchen table. Beside me was the photo album I'd rescued from the estate when Jonathan fell ill. Pictures I'd taken without permission, memories I'd stolen to prove I'd existed. Jonathan at his drafting table, absorbed in his work. Lauren and Billy at the beach, where I'd taken them when Lauren needed space from her new baby. Jonathan accepting his architecture award, me in the background, adjusting his tie before he went on stage. "You were never in the spotlight," Sadie had told me once. "You were always the one making sure the spotlight worked." My phone buzzed, a text from Henry, Jonathan's lawyer. "On schedule for 3 p.m., all arrangements confirmed as discussed." Are you certain about this? I hadn't been the one to arrange this. Jonathan had. 3 weeks before his death, when we'd thought the doctors had found a new treatment, he'd visited Henry alone. When he returned that afternoon, he'd sat with me in the sunroom, taken my hand in both of his, and said something I'd never expected. "I've been a coward, Eleanor. For 30 years, I've let fear guide my decisions. Fear of disrupting Lauren's grief. Fear of admitting I needed something different than what I had with my first wife. But I won't leave you to face that fear alone." I hadn't understood then what he meant. I'd assumed it was the medication talking, making him philosophical. Now I understood perfectly. My phone buzzed again. This time, Billy. "Eleanor, I'm sorry about the cemetery. Mom wouldn't let me interfere. Are you okay?" I typed back, "I'm fine, dear. I'll see you at the house at 3. His response came quickly. "Mom says you're not invited to the reception either." "I'll be there anyway." 3 dots appeared and disappeared several times before he responded, "I'll make sure you get in." At 2:45, I arrived at the house I'd called home for 3 decades. The Grand Victorian stood proud on its hill, the wraparound porch draped in black bunting for the occasion. Cars lined the circular driveway, BMWs, Mercedes, the kind of vehicles befitting Jonathan's professional circle. I parked my modest Honda beside Sadie's car, grateful she'd insisted on coming with me. "Remember," she said as we approached the door, "you belong here more than half these people." Lauren answered the door herself. Her eyes widened when she saw me, then narrowed to slits. "I thought I made myself clear this morning. Henry Lowell asked me to be here," I said simply, "for the reading of the will." Lauren paused, recalculating. "There's no formal reading scheduled. We'll handle the will privately, later this week." "Henry specifically said 3 o'clock, I persisted. "Perhaps you should check with him." Before she could respond, Henry himself appeared behind her, his silver hair immaculate as always, his 3-piece suit pressed to perfection. "Ah, Eleanor. Right on time. Lauren, I did mention this morning that we'd need to read Jonathan's will this afternoon. There's been some confusion," Lauren said quickly. "We should do this on another day, privately." "Jonathan's instructions were quite clear," Henry interrupted. "All family and principal beneficiaries should be present. That includes Eleanor." Behind Lauren, I could see Billy watching from the foyer. Other mourners had gathered in the living room, drinks in hand, speaking in hushed tones that grew quieter as they noticed our conversation. "Principal beneficiaries," Lauren's voice carried a note of amusement. "Eleanor won't need to be present for that discussion." Henry adjusted his glasses. "I think you'll find, Lauren, that your father's recent revisions will surprise you." The first crack appeared in Lauren's composure. She glanced between Henry and me, then forced a laugh. "Recent revisions?" My father discussed everything with me. "There are no revisions." "Shall we proceed to the library?" Henry suggested. "I believe Jonathan would want this handled with dignity and privacy." Lauren stepped aside reluctantly, her gaze burning into me as I passed. The familiar scent of the house, beeswax polish and old books, wrapped around me like a forgotten embrace. Nothing had changed since Jonathan's death 2 days ago, yet everything felt different. In the library, Henry arranged chairs in a semicircle facing Jonathan's mahogany desk. Approximately 20 people filtered in. Business partners, close friends, distant relatives. Lauren positioned herself prominently in the front row, Billy beside her, looking increasingly uncomfortable. I chose a seat near the back, next to Sadie. From here I could see everyone's faces as Henry prepared to read. "Before we begin," Henry announced, "I want to acknowledge this is an unusual circumstance. Jonathan insisted that his will be read aloud before witnesses to prevent any later confusion or dispute." He paused, letting his gaze settle on Lauren. "He was very specific about this requirement." Lauren maintained her confident smile, but I noticed her manicured fingers gripping the armrest of her chair. She had no idea what was coming. None of them did, except Billy, who caught my eye and gave a small nod of encouragement. Henry opened the folder containing Jonathan's last testament. The room fell silent as he began to read in his measured attorney's voice. "I, Jonathan Whitcomb, being of sound mind and body." The standard opening phrases washed over the group. Lauren's posture remained perfect, her chin slightly lifted as if already accepting her inheritance. I thought of all the times I'd supported her from the shadows, helping with college applications she never acknowledged, preparing her childhood bedroom for her visits home with Billy, maintaining family traditions she took for granted. Henry continued reading, his voice steady but growing louder as he reached the crucial sections. "To my daughter Lauren, I leave my love and the understanding that I have failed her in many ways. The education and opportunities I provided, while substantial, came at the cost of emotional honesty. I leave her my collection of her mother's jewelry and a trust fund of $100,000 to be distributed upon her acceptance of the following truth. Her stepmother, Eleanor, was never my second choice, but my redemption." The room shifted. Whispers started. Lauren's smile froze on her face. Henry took a deep breath and continued. "To my beloved wife, Eleanor, who has lived in shadows cast by my own cowardice, I leave everything else. The house on Harbor Road, my architectural practice including all intellectual property and client contracts, my investment portfolio, and my personal effects. She has earned not just my love, but my deepest respect for 3 decades of grace under the heaviest burden I could have placed on her, being loved by a man too afraid to publicly defend that love." The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone turned to look at me, some with shock, others with dawning understanding. Lauren's face had gone white, her green eyes wide with disbelief. "This is impossible," she whispered. He told me." But her words trailed off as the implications sank in. Henry wasn't finished. He continued reading about smaller bequests to staff and charities, but the battle had already been won. Or perhaps, I realized as Lauren finally turned to face me fully, it had just begun. From across the room, her voice cut through the murmurs. "You did this. Somehow, you manipulated him. 30 years of guilting him into—" "Lauren," Billy spoke up quietly but firmly, "let Mr. Lowell finish." Henry looked at me over his glasses, a question in his eyes. I nodded slightly, and he reached for another document I'd seen him place beneath the will. Jonathan also left a letter to be read aloud at this time, Henry announced. He wrote it 1 week before his death. And with those words, Jonathan's voice, preserved in his careful script, would finally speak the truth he'd been too afraid to voice in life. The truth that would change everything Lauren thought she knew about our marriage, about me, about the 30 years I'd spent proving my love didn't need a spotlight to shine true. Henry cleared his throat and began reading Jonathan's letter, his usually steady voice catching slightly on the words. By the time you hear this, I will be gone. Lauren, my daughter, I owe you an apology I should have made 30 years ago. When your mother died, I was lost. Eleanor found me in my grief and loved me back to life, but I was too afraid of losing you to let her occupy the space she deserved in our family. Every time you belittled her meals, dismissed her kindness, or treated her as invisible, I should have spoken up. Instead, I let Eleanor bear the weight of my cowardice. She never asked to be acknowledged, never demanded my defense. But she deserved both. Eleanor, you saved me twice. First from sorrow, then from the shame of letting you live as a shadow in your own marriage. I leave you everything, not as payment, but as the inheritance love should have earned long ago. The paper rustled as Henry folded it. A few people dared to glance between Lauren and me. Billy had moved to the edge of his seat, watching his mother with concern. There's one final provision, Henry continued. Jonathan arranged for Eleanor to have immediate access to all accounts and property titles. The transition is effective immediately. No! Lauren stood suddenly, her chair screeching against the hardwood floor. This isn't legal. He couldn't. Her voice cracked, not with sadness, but with the sound of certainty shattering. I'm his daughter, his blood. 30 years of what? The words slipped out before I could stop them, surprising everyone, especially myself. All eyes turned to me as I rose slowly, straightening my spine. 30 years of treating me like a hired hand. 30 years of letting your father's guest hear your mockery while I washed your dishes. 30 years of telling your son I was Eleanor while teaching him to call your friends aunt and uncle. Lauren's face reddened. You have no idea what it was like to lose my mother and see my father replace her with someone who helped him find happiness again. I stepped closer, my voice steady. Someone who raised your son when you were too busy with your social life. Someone who kept your father's house, managed his appointments, and packed his lunches with the same care, whether anyone noticed or not. The room had gone quiet again. Sadie gave me an encouraging nod, while Billy looked at his mother with something new in his eyes. Perhaps understanding, perhaps disappointment. I had his business partners lined up to dissolve the practice, Lauren said, her voice barely above a whisper. I had real estate agents ready to list this house. She swallowed. I had plans. As did Jonathan. Henry interjected quietly. Lauren sank back into her chair, staring at her hands. The mourners began to shift, some making excuses to leave, others offering quiet condolences to me as they passed. Mrs. Whitcomb. Eleanor. If that's all right, Henry said gently. I'll need you to sign some documents. Perhaps we could use Jonathan's study? I glanced at Lauren once more. She sat perfectly still, but I could see her calculating, planning, searching for angles. This wasn't over for her, I knew that. But for the first time in 30 years, I didn't fear her next move. Actually, Billy stood up, his voice cutting through the tension. I'd like to say something." Everyone turned to him. "I've spent my whole life watching Eleanor be treated like she didn't belong here. My mother would tell me stories about how Eleanor stole my grandfather's heart, how she wasn't really family." He walked to stand beside me. "But Eleanor was the one who taught me to ride a bike. She was the one who stayed up with me during thunderstorms. She was the one who attended every school play when my mother was in Boston socializing." "Billy," Lauren warned, but he continued undeterred. His next words would shift the family dynamic forever, whether anyone was prepared or not. "I'm 24 years old, and I've spent my whole life watching the wrong woman be labeled the outsider in this family." He looked directly at Lauren. "Maybe it's time we acknowledged who really earned their place here, and who merely inherited it." The silence that followed was different from before. Not shocked, but contemplative. Lauren stood abruptly and walked toward the door, pausing only to deliver one final proclamation that would echo in my mind for days to come. "This isn't over, Eleanor. Blood is thicker than ink." As she left, taking several of Jonathan's business associates with her, I felt Sadie's gentle hand on my arm. "Shall we sign those papers now? I believe you have a business to run." For the first time since arriving, I smiled. Jonathan had left me more than property. He'd left me the freedom to finally step into the light. In Jonathan's study, as I signed document after document, transferring everything into my name, I thought about his letter. He'd understood finally what I'd always known, that love doesn't require witnesses to be real, but respect does. And respect, once earned through silence, speaks loudest when it finally finds its voice. "There's one more thing," Henry said, reaching into his briefcase. "Jonathan left this for you personally." He handed me a small box. Inside was my grandmother's ruby ring, the one I'd sold to pay for Lauren's art therapy when she was 16, the one I told Jonathan had been stolen. Tucked beneath it was a note in his handwriting. I knew. "I've always known. Forgive me for waiting so long to give you what you deserved all along." The weight of 30 years lifted from my shoulders. Not all at once, but enough to breathe easier than I had in decades. The post-funeral gathering continued around us, but I was exactly where I needed to be. Finally, after all these years, taking my rightful place in my own life. Tomorrow would bring challenges as Lauren contested the will, as I learned to navigate the architectural practice, as I discovered what it meant to live without the constant background hum of resentment. But today, as rain continued to tap against the study windows and Sadie squeezed my hand supportively, I allowed myself something I'd forgotten how to feel: hope. The house was mine now. The life was mine. And most importantly, the truth was finally mine to tell. As I stood to leave Jonathan's study with Henry's final documents, the real weight of what had just transpired settled over me. The house, the practice, Jonathan's private collection of architectural sketches I'd always admired, all mine now. But the inheritance felt less like receiving something than taking back what should have been mine all along. "I'll be setting up meetings with the practice partners next week," I told Henry as we returned to the main hall. The crowd had thinned considerably, leaving only a handful of intimate friends and family. Lauren waited by the front door, her mascara slightly smudged. When she saw me, she straightened as if gathering herself for one final battle. "I want you to know," she said, her voice steady but without its earlier venom. "I'm going to contest this. My father was clearly not in his right mind when... Lauren." I stopped just inside the door, close enough that only the immediate circle could hear. "Jonathan visited Henry 3 weeks ago. He was lucid. He was deliberate. And he'd been planning this for longer than that. Her shoulders sagged slightly. But surely you understand. This house, the practice, it's my inheritance, my birthright. For the first time, I looked at her, not with the weariness of 3 decades, but with simple clarity. Your inheritance was the love of a father who gave you every advantage, every opportunity. My inheritance was earning that same father's respect through daily acts of devotion he never acknowledged. Billy approached, placing a gentle hand on his mother's arm. "Mom, let's go. We can talk about this another time." "Just answer me one thing," Lauren said as Billy led her toward the door. "Did you always know that he would do this?" "I didn't know about the will," I answered honestly. "But I always knew that I loved your father exactly as he was. A brilliant architect, a grieving widower, and yes, a man too afraid to defend his second marriage. I loved all of it. That, Lauren, is what your father finally recognized." She nodded once, a gesture I couldn't quite interpret, and allowed Billy to guide her out. At the threshold, he turned back to me. "Can I call you sometime? Maybe take you to lunch next week? I'd like to understand everything better." "I'd like that very much, Billy." As they left, Sadie appeared at my side with my coat. "Quite a day for you." "Quite 30 years, I corrected. The departing mourners offered various combinations of sympathy and congratulations, each processing the day's revelations in their own way. Some had witnessed years of Lauren's dismissiveness. Others were seeing our family dynamics clearly for the first time. When the house finally emptied, save for Sadie, Henry, and myself, I walked through the rooms I'd maintained for 3 decades. The parlor where I'd hosted Lauren's engagement party, carefully arranging flowers while she told guests I did have an eye for domestic things. The dining room where I'd served countless holiday meals, watching from the kitchen door as Jonathan carved the turkey while Lauren held court at the other end of the table. "What will you do?" Sadie asked, finding me in the kitchen where I stood at the familiar sink, running my hands over the copper fixtures I'd polished weekly. "I'll keep the house," I said. "Jonathan's practice needs leadership, and I know his work better than anyone realizes. But first..." I walked to the window overlooking the garden. "First, I'm going to plant those lilies, right where they can be seen from the breakfast nook. The ones from the cemetery gate. The ones I'm buying tomorrow. White lilies, a whole bed of them." The afternoon light was fading as Henry prepared to leave. "I'll have all the paperwork finalized by Monday. The practice partners have been notified. Some may be surprised to learn how much you know about architectural law and project management." I smiled, remembering all the late nights when I'd helped Jonathan with proposals, organized his filing system, learned his coding methods. It's amazing what people don't notice about the work of someone they consider merely helpful. After they left, I stood in the front hall, looking at my reflection in the century-old mirror Jonathan's first wife had hung there. The woman looking back wasn't the diminished figure who'd been turned away from the cemetery that morning. She was someone I was just beginning to meet. Eleanor Whitcomb. Not defined by the shadows she'd inhabited, but by the light she'd maintained despite them. My phone buzzed. A text from Billy. "I told Mom the truth about how often you visited me at school, about the money you sent behind her back." She didn't say anything, just looked out the window for a long time. "Maybe there's hope." I replied simply, "There's always hope, dear." Sunset painted the harbor in shades of gold and rose as I moved through each room, touching the furniture I'd chosen, the paintings I'd hung, the memories I'd created in spaces where I'd been treated as guest. Tomorrow would bring the practical matter of running Jonathan's practice. Next week, probably legal challenges from Lauren. But tonight, I allowed myself to simply exist in my own home, where the doorbell would never again summon me to my own humiliation, where the kitchen would finally be mine to inhabit fully, where the story of our family would finally be told completely. Before bed, I visited Jonathan's home office one more time, sitting at his drafting table where sketches for his final project still lay abandoned. He'd been designing a community center when he fell ill, a space where art classes, reading groups, and workshops could bring people together across generations. I picked up his charcoal pencil, still resting where he'd left it, and in the margin of his drawing wrote, "To be completed in loving memory." Tomorrow I would make sure the project continued. It seemed fitting that Jonathan's last building would be one devoted to bridging divides rather than maintaining them. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. Through the window, I could see the moon rising over the harbor, painting a silver path across the dark water. It reminded me of something Jonathan had once said early in our marriage. The best architecture doesn't fight the landscape. It finds its place within it. For 30 years, I'd tried to find my place in his landscape, adapting myself to fit the spaces left by loss and resentment. Tonight, I understood that I hadn't been building myself to fit his architecture. I'd been building something entirely new, a structure that could finally stand on its own. Monday morning brought fresh challenges with Lauren's lawyer's letter, delivered before coffee had finished brewing. The words blurred together. Undue influence, mental capacity, rightful inheritance. But the threat was clear. I set the letter aside and dressed for my first official day at Whitcomb and Associates Architects. The office hadn't changed since Jonathan's death. His coffee mug still sat on his desk, a half-finished project pinned to the wall. His secretary, Patricia, looked up when I entered. "Mrs. Whitcomb." She hesitated. "I wasn't sure." "Call me Eleanor, please." I tried to steady my voice. "Shall we go over the active projects?" For 3 hours, Patricia walked me through contracts and meetings with a patience I hadn't expected. By noon, I understood why Jonathan had insisted on immediate transition. 2 major projects needed signatures only I could provide now. My phone rang just as Patricia left for lunch. Lauren. "Meet me at the Blue Moon Cafe in an hour," she said without greeting. "We need to talk privately." The cafe was nearly empty at 1 p.m. Lauren had chosen a corner table, 2 untouched waters waiting. She'd aged overnight, dark circles beneath careful makeup, fingers drumming restlessly. "I had lunch with Henry's partner this morning," she began without preamble. "The will is ironclad. Dad's mental capacity was documented extensively." I waited. "But I can make this difficult for you. The practice partners might not accept your leadership easily. Dad's clients might hesitate. The community knows you as his quiet wife, not his business equal." I finally spoke. "What do you want, Lauren?" 20% of the practice, the vineyard property Dad bought in Napa, and this changes nothing between us. You're still not family." I looked at her carefully. This was the daughter I'd packed lunches for, whose teenage tears I'd privately soothed while pretending not to notice. The mother who'd left her infant son with me every Tuesday for 2 years, while attending art classes that were actually therapy sessions she was too proud to admit needing. "I'll make you a different offer," I said. "I'll sell you the Napa property at fair market value. The money goes to Billy's education fund. He already has a trust. For graduate school, then. Or starting his own business. He told me yesterday he wants to study sustainable architecture." Something shifted in her face. perhaps surprised that I knew this about her son. I continued. I'll also keep you on the board of the community center project. Jonathan would want his legacy to include you. The practice stays with you. Yes. She studied her water glass. You were never stupid, were you? Always watching, always knowing more than you let on. I had to be. You made sure of that. And if I try to turn the partners against you, I'll remind them that I've been managing Dad's files for 30 years, that I negotiated 3 contracts while he was in the hospital, that Patricia will confirm I know every active project intimately. You planned this, somehow? No, I said truthfully. Your father planned it. I just survived long enough to see it through. We sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Lauren reached into her purse and pulled out a small object wrapped in tissue paper. My mother's cameo. Dad gave it to me when I was 16. I've been wearing it every important day since. She unwrapped it slowly. The day I told him I was engaged, I wore it. The day Billy was born. Today. She placed it on the table between us. She would have hated you for taking her place. I never took her place, I said gently. She left a space that needed different filling. Your father found someone to walk quietly where she had walked boldly. God, even now you're infuriatingly measured. But there was less bite in it. Fine. The Napa property for Billy's fund, community center board position, and Thanksgiving dinner, here, with you hosting, if you can bear having me at your table. It was the closest she'd come to acknowledging the dinners where she'd criticized my cooking while taking seconds. I can bear it. She gathered her things, pausing at the table's edge. Billy's right to like you. I see that now. Doesn't mean I have to. No, I agreed. It doesn't. After she left, I sat with my own water, watching the harbor through rain-streaked windows. The cameo remained on the table. Lauren had simply walked away, leaving it behind like so many conversations we'd never finished. I picked it up, examining the delicate profile carved in pink stone. Jonathan's first wife smiled eternally in miniature, just as Lauren's memory of her remained frozen in perfection. I wrapped it carefully and put it in my purse. Perhaps someday, in a moment neither of us had planned, I would find a way to return it that didn't feel like winning or losing. Returning to the office, I found Patricia had arranged the afternoon meetings. By 5 p.m., I'd signed my first contract as president of Whitcomb and Associates. The partners had been polite, professional, and clearly surprised by my grasp of structural details. Jonathan always said you had an eye for his work, Mr. Robinson noted as he prepared to leave. He just never mentioned you could read blueprints like an engineer. He encouraged my interest, I replied. But understanding that would have meant seeing me differently. Robinson nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes what we choose not to see says more about us than about them. Evening found me alone in my house, where I finally allowed myself to truly grieve. Not for Jonathan's death, which I'd been mourning privately for months as his illness progressed, but for the 30 years of half-acknowledgement, of love given but not defended, of a place earned but never granted. I sat at his drafting table looking at the community center plans. Tomorrow I would call the contractors and tell them to begin Phase 2. There would be art rooms for classes like Lauren had pretended to take, meeting spaces for people to bridge divides rather than entrench them, a library area where stories could be shared without shadows. The moon rose full and bright over the harbor. Through the window, I could see its reflection creating that silver path again. Tonight, I understood I'd been traveling along it all these years. Not toward Jonathan's shore, but toward my own island of strength, built quietly beneath the water while everyone watched the surface. My inheritance wasn't just property and practice, it was permission to finally inhabit my own life fully, to wake tomorrow not as the woman who endured, but as the woman who prevailed, to transform silent service into visible leadership, hidden knowledge into open authority. The cameo sat on my desk beside a photo of Billy as a baby, mother and son separated by misunderstanding, both deserving of truth. Perhaps that would be my greatest project, not building bridges of brick and mortar, but of forgiveness and recognition. But that work could wait. Tonight, for the first time in 30 years, I went to bed in a house that was completely, legally, indisputably mine. 6 months after Jonathan's funeral, I stood in his office, now mine, and realized I'd stopped thinking of him as Jonathan, my husband, and started remembering him as Jonathan, the architect. The distinction felt important. Patricia knocked, entering with that day's mail. Among the architectural journals and contract proposals was a cream envelope bearing Billy's return address in Boston. Dear Eleanor, I passed my architecture boards last week. Mom actually drove down for the celebration, her first time visiting me at school. She stayed for dinner and asked about my thesis on sustainable community spaces. Progress, maybe? The cameo you sent helped. She wore it to my graduation. I've accepted a junior position with Chen and Associates in Portland. Close enough to visit, far enough to build something of my own. Just like you're doing, Billy. I traced his signature, remembering teaching him to write his name at my kitchen table when Lauren was too overwhelmed to handle it herself. Now he'd grown into someone who understood buildings weren't just structures. They were stories made tangible. The community center had opened last month. I'd kept Jonathan's vision, but added elements he would have been too cautious to include. A workshop space for former inmates learning trades. A commercial kitchen for cooking classes run by immigrant families. During the opening ceremony, Lauren had surprised everyone, including herself, I suspect, by giving a brief speech acknowledging my role as the project's quiet but persistent champion. A knock interrupted my reflection. Sadie Tran peered around the door. Thought you might want coffee before the Stevens meeting. She carried 2 mugs, settling comfortably in the visitor's chair. How are the lilies? I smiled. The lily bed was my small rebellion, where Lauren had once insisted on precise rows of designer roses. White lilies now bloomed freely, wild but beautiful. Like you, Sadie observed. 6 months of defying expectations. I hardly know you anymore. Perhaps you know me better than I knew myself. The Stevens meeting filled my afternoon, a young couple wanting to build their first home with sustainable materials. As I sketched preliminary ideas, I caught myself making notes with gestures that echoed Jonathan's hand movements. Some inheritances lived in muscle memory. By 5 o'clock, the office had emptied. I stayed late to finish documentation, something I'd done countless times as Jonathan's wife. But now I signed my own name in bold strokes, no longer needing the careful precision that had hidden my presence for 30 years. Rain began as I locked the office, creating musical harmonies on the metal stairs. In my car, I paused before starting the engine, watching water cascade down the windshield. The cemetery was 3 blocks away. 10 minutes later, I stood at Jonathan's grave with a single white lily. No elaborate bouquet this time, just one perfect bloom. His headstone was simple. Jonathan Whitcomb, architect, father, husband, built with vision and love. I placed the lily at its base and spoke aloud for the first time since the funeral. You knew. 3 weeks before you died, you knew. Even then you couldn't tell me to my face what you wrote in that letter, but you did the work that mattered. You wrote it down." The rain softened to mist. "I don't know if I forgive you yet for 30 years of silence, but I'm grateful you found your voice before it was too late." Lauren's car appeared at the cemetery entrance. She approached slowly, hesitantly, holding a bouquet of roses. We hadn't planned to meet here, but grief doesn't follow schedules. We stood side by side in silence before she spoke. "I came here every week the first month, every day the first week." "I know, the groundskeeper told me." She glanced at me, surprised. "You asked about me?" "I asked about the lilies I left at the gate. He mentioned you brought sunflowers, your mother's favorite." "Lilies make me nervous. They smell like hospitals." "They smell like new beginnings to me." We placed our flowers together. Lauren's roses, deep red and proper, my single lily, pure and quiet. Somehow they belonged beside each other. "The house?" she asked as we walked to our cars. "Still standing, still yours to visit whenever you like." "The practice? Profitable. Your father would be proud of how we've modernized while keeping his standards." "And you?" I considered. "I'm learning to take up space." She almost smiled. "God knows there's enough of it. That house always felt too small when you tried to shrink yourself." At my car, I turned back. "You know what I finally understand? You weren't protecting your mother's memory by keeping me out. You were protecting yourself from knowing your father could love again, fully." "Maybe." She adjusted her coat against the evening chill. "Maybe I was protecting myself from seeing how little I'd earned my place while watching you earn yours every day." It was the most honest sentence she'd ever spoken to me. "Thanksgiving's next month," I said. "I'm making my mother's recipe for bread stuffing, the one you always claimed was too dry." "It probably still is. Probably. But Billy will eat 3 helpings and pretend it's perfect." She laughed, a real sound, not the practiced social notes I'd heard for 30 years. "He gets that from you. The diplomacy." I shook my head. "He gets that from understanding that family is more complicated than blood. Something I learned from watching you struggle with it." We parted without hugging or making promises. But as I drove home, to my house, my achievement, my space, I felt lighter than I had in years. The revenge everyone had expected hadn't materialized. Instead, something quieter had emerged. Understanding, however fragile. That night, I sat in the sunroom where Jonathan had told me about being a coward. His words echoed differently now. "I won't leave you to face that fear alone." He'd meant Lauren, the inheritance battle, the questions of belonging. But he'd given me something more valuable than money or property. He'd given me permission to stand fully in my own light. The moon rose again over Bar Harbor, painting its silver path across dark waters. I still owned the cottage where this chapter had begun, my refuge before marrying Jonathan. Tomorrow I would visit it, perhaps decide whether to keep it as memory or sell it as unnecessary anchor. But tonight, in this house that was finally, truly mine, I allowed myself to imagine future chapters. Billy visiting with his own designs to discuss, Sadie stopping by for late-night coffee, Lauren occasionally joining holiday dinners where all seats were equal at the table. I removed my wedding ring, studying its worn surface in the lamplight. 30 years of wearing it had left a slight indentation on my finger, a permanent reminder that wouldn't disappear quickly. Some marks, I understood now, were meant to stay. The ring joined the cameo in my jewelry box, artifacts of a complicated history that no longer defined my future. Outside, rain continued its gentle percussion, washing the world clean while promising tomorrow's possibilities. In the morning I would wake as Eleanor Whitcomb, architect's widow, yes, but also business owner, community leader, woman who'd finally learned that quiet strength doesn't require invisibility to survive. My inheritance had been more than money. It was the revelation that I'd always possessed the power to claim my place. I'd simply needed someone else's permission to see it. And perhaps that was Jonathan's greatest gift. Not the will that redistributed wealth, but the recognition that allowed me to redistribute my own worth. The last thing I thought before sleep claimed me was this: some inheritances come wrapped in grief, but open into freedom. And freedom, once acknowledged, creates its own legacy. The harbor whispered its ancient rhythms outside my window as I drifted off, finally at peace in a bed that had always been mine, in a house that now legally proved it, in a life that I'd quietly earned one day at a time for 30 years. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. It always did. But I would face them as myself, fully present. No longer the woman who loved from shadows, but the one who'd learned that true inheritance isn't passed down through blood or even legal documents. It's claimed moment by moment, through the courage to occupy your own space completely. And that inheritance, once accepted, could never be contested or taken away. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will talk.